A lot of people say Kanto is the best Pokemon region hands down, and others say it's the most overrated region of all time. So I played every single game that has Kanto to figure out if it's really that good. Kanto is where Pokemon began. For a lot of people, if you ask them to imagine Pokemon, they will think of the Kanto region. And design-wise, Kanto is pretty solid. Starting in Pallet Town and going through the rest of the region is a pretty nice journey. I love that all of the town names are based on a certain theme, and having colors be that theme works well. The town you begin any Pokemon game in is usually not that incredible, and in this case, Pallet Town is just 2 houses and a lab, which is pretty much the standard for any Pokemon game. But Kanto does a really good job of keeping you on a linear path, but having you feel like you're exploring a grand region. As much as I absolutely love Black and White, they have you going on a literal loop. And though this is not that much different, the order in which you explore things is. Going out and around the entire region and eventually back into the middle is a cool idea, even though the reason you can't explore the middle is really dumb. Once you get done with Cerulean City, you would think logically the next place to go is through the gate to the next town, but no, you skip Saffron City and go directly to Viridian City, which I totally understand, but you're telling me I can't go through because this guard has not had tea yet? Hey, how's it going? Do you mind if I get through real quick? Oh no, I can't do that. I haven't had a drink yet. Saffron is the largest city in the entire game, and you can't even go there until well into the main story, which only half makes sense. I distinctly remember playing through Red and Blue for the first time, wondering what was gonna happen when I got to Saffron City. Being allowed to go pretty much anywhere you want besides there is a good idea, but that being the reason is just really dumb. And it doesn't matter if it's a bottle of water like in Red and Blue, or a glass of tea like in FireRed and LeafGreen. It is a really dumb idea. But other than that small issue, exploring Kanto is a great time. There are so many incredibly iconic locations spread out throughout the region. Whether it's Lavender Town having one of the most iconic video game soundtracks of all time, and the creepy tower where I guess everybody in Kanto has collectively agreed to store their dead Pokemon. They just charged me $40 to ship my dead Pokemon to Lavender Town. And having one of, if not the best safari zone in all of Pokemon, which is extremely fun to explore, and it changes up how you play Pokemon. The amount of times I've wanted to throw a rock at a Pokemon is not very high, but you can bet if I'm in the safari zone, I'm throwing as many rocks as I possibly can. And of course, you can't forget about the Pokemon Mansion, an abandoned mansion on Cinnabar Island that has so much lore and details about how the Pokemon world came to be, and what led to the creation of Mewtwo. Almost every location in Kanto is worth exploring, with tons of hidden secrets to be found and good times to be had. So for region design, I'm giving Kanto an 8.5 out of 10. But of course, being in a Pokemon game, you have to talk about the Pokemon themselves. Kanto is known for having some of the best Pokemon of all time. The original 151 Pokemon are beloved by fans. Even my favorite Pokemon of all time is part of this generation. Say something bad about Bellsprout, I dare you. Right out of the gate, you're given a great selection of starter Pokemon. Charmander, Charmeleon, and Charizard are arguably the most popular Pokemon of all time. I'm not one of the people who says Charizard is the best Pokemon ever, but to say he looks bad is just incorrect. Bulbasaur, Ivysaur, and Venusaur are also incredible, where you get to watch a Pokemon literally bloom into the best version of itself, and even though Venusaur is kind of ugly, I can't hold it against it because it's at least well designed. And my favorites, Squirtle, Wartortle, and Blastoise are all incredible. Going from a small, cute turtle into a literal tank is one of my favorite evolution lines of all time. And that doesn't even include Pikachu and Eevee, who are technically both starters in this region. Pikachu is the most famous Pokemon of all time, being the mascot for the entire franchise. And even though as a starter, I don't think he's the best, you can't deny that Pikachu is synonymous with the word Pokemon. And no matter what anyone says, Eevee is just adorable. Similar to Charmander, I totally understand the hype, but it's not my personal favorite, especially when you're playing Let's Go and you're not able to evolve him into anything else. But overall, the starter selection of Pokemon is one of the best in the entire series. I have never met someone who said the Kanto starters are bad, and I don't think I ever will. And the rest of the region also has some pretty incredible Pokemon. In my opinion, Kanto is the weakest with the early game selection of Pokemon. Up until about the second gym, there isn't the best selection. The regional bird for Kanto is Pidgey, and I don't dislike Pidgey at all, but it's also just kinda there. Throughout my history of playing through Kanto games, I don't think there's a single time where I needed to have a Pidgey on my team. other than to just fly me from point A to point B. Caterpie's line and Weedle's line are also both kind of fine. Don't get me wrong, I love Metapod and Kakuna as much as the next guy, which is about 0%. And especially in Pokemon Red and Blue, the early game is not very balanced depending on who you pick as your starter. If Charmander is your selection in Pokemon Red, then you're kinda just out of luck. Which I'm not sure if it's just me, but if I'm playing through Pokemon Red, I'm probably going to grab Charmander. He's on the box, I need him. All of the Pokemon you're going to find on early routes don't really help for Brock, which isn't as much of a problem in Pokemon Blue because you can get a Mankey in that game, but he's a version exclusive. So if you're playing Pokemon Red, you really only have two choices. Either painfully grind your Charmander up until he's able to take on Brock, or get a Butterfree and hope for the best. Luckily, after the second gym, things start opening up quite a bit, where you're able to find a bunch more Pokemon you wouldn't have been able to before, and individually, I think Kanto has a bunch of great Pokemon. There's Magikarp, Gyarados, Dragonite, Snorlax, Lapras, Arcanine, Scyther, and of course Bellsprout, who are all incredible Pokemon and are fan favorites to this day. And of course, I'm willing to admit it could be nostalgia, but there's a reason these Pokemon have stood the test of time. And that doesn't even touch on the legendary Pokemon of this region.
Unless you count Arcanine, I guess.
I think at baseline, the legendary birds are great. Articuno is in my opinion the best. There's something about the design and typing that really calls out to me. I also really like Zapdos, because a giant electric bird just kinda works. And I can't lie, I don't really love Moltres, but he fits with the theme and works pretty well. I just can't stop imagining what he would look like without the flames. But of course, the best legendary is absolutely Mewtwo. This is the only Pokemon generation that doesn't have the typical box art legendary, so it doesn't matter what version of Kanto you play, you're getting a Mewtwo. And honestly, I'm fine with that. As far as design goes, Mewtwo is incredible. It looks like a psychic powerhouse, which is exactly what it is. Everybody remembers going through Cerulean City and seeing the one cave door. But of course, you can't access it until you become the Pokemon League champion. And that bothered me all the way through my first playthrough of the game. And once I finally got there and I was able to go confront Mewtwo myself, I instantly knew this was a great Pokemon. The way they built up Mewtwo as a failed experiment on Cinnabar Island just made me want to battle him more. But it's kind of disappointing there's only the 4 legendary Pokemon available in this game. I know it was the first generation, so legendary had a much firmer meaning, but it would have been great to have a second Pokemon, or to split Mew and Mewtwo between the 2 different versions, which I think would have made the Pokemon in this region even better. But as it stands, from starters all the way through the game, I think Kanto has a solid selection of Pokemon, and I understand the argument for this being the best selection of Pokemon of all time. So I'm giving Kanto a 9 out of 10 on Pokemon variety. So far, Kanto is proving to be great, but there's one specific location where I think Kanto struggles more than any other region, and that's with its story. Starting off the game, you play as Red, or whatever you name your character, but we're just gonna call him Red. Red is a young child who sets out on his Pokemon journey with the goal to be the Pokemon League champion. His rival is Blue, or whatever you name him, as long as it's nice.
Oh man.
Blue is your childhood neighbor, and overall, he just kinda sucks. He's Professor Oak's grandson, and whenever given the opportunity, he will just say something rude, and that's something that I like. It gives me the goal to want to beat him. It's a classic rivalry where you and your opponent are going through the same trials. But call it karma, or it's just that he's a bad trainer, Blue is somehow always one step ahead of you, but he is almost always not as strong. Going through your journey, you'll see him time and time again, and he'll say something mean, and then you will wipe the floor with him, and you will rinse and repeat that interaction over and over again. There is almost no character development that happens during the game. Blue is just kind of there to be an obstacle in your path to overcome, and that is exactly what this story needed. Going through your journey with someone that you want to beat is always nice. After Generation 2, Pokemon got on the train of friendly rivalries, where no matter what happens, your rival is always nice to you. And I'm fine with that, especially if it's done well, but usually it just ends up with me getting annoyed that I have to fight a rival, instead of me wanting to actually beat them. But Blue is someone who you want to beat whenever he appears on screen. He provokes you and pushes you into wanting to beat him. which is great and pretty much the only story this game has. From the beginning of the game, you're given the Pokédex with the task of filling it with all 151 Pokemon. Professor Oak is apparently too old to do it, and he tasks you and Blue to fill it out for him. This is the overarching goal in pretty much every Pokemon game, but along your path of fighting gyms, your rival, and collecting Pokemon, there's Team Rocket, a criminal organization whose only real goal is to just steal people's Pokemon and be the worst. And don't get me wrong, I love Team Rocket for that reason, but you can't tell me that's an engaging story. Team Rocket is a criminal organization that has taken over Saffron City and other various locations throughout the Kanto region, and throughout your journey, you're tasked with taking them down. We don't really get a full explanation of why Team Rocket's being the worst, what their end goal is, or why they dress like this. All you're really told throughout the story is that Team Rocket is bad and it's your job to beat them down. They do take an entire building hostage.
I have been there.
But overall, as a villain organization, they're just kind of there. One thing they do incredibly well is be simple. There's no world-ending plot to go into a different dimension. It's just a group of bad guys that you need to take down, which would be perfect if they took the simplicity and gave it stakes. I can't think of a single reason why Red needs to defeat Team Rocket, other than the fact that he just kind of gets roped into doing it, almost in a wrong place, wrong time kind of situation. So if there were any stakes that made it so Red needed to save the day, it would have been 100 times better. But as it is, Team Rocket is just kind of there. Team Rocket does have one saving grace, and that is that they are led by Giovanni, the 8th gym leader. When I was a kid and I found out Giovanni was the last gym leader, my jaw hit the floor.
No, you can't do that.
I think it was a great idea to have the first gym that you see on your journey, that was closed and locked for an unexplained reason, be led by the leader of the main antagonist group. And maybe it's because I was 7 years old, but I had zero idea this would happen, and I loved every second of it. But outside of that and the rival battles, there really wasn't a story. You just had to deal with all of the things that were already going wrong in the Kanto region, because being Red, you are the Pokemon prodigy, and one of, if not the best Pokemon trainers of all time. And for that reason, I'm giving Kanto a 3 out of 10 on story. But during this time, people weren't really playing Pokemon for the story, more so for the gameplay. And Kanto has one of the widest varieties of gameplay in the Pokemon series. But we're gonna start where the series began, with Pokemon Red and Blue. I love these games with every fiber of my being, but they are janky and broken. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing, it is very fun a lot of the time. But compared to a lot of the other games in the series where they've worked out a ton of bugs, these games are wild to go back to. At its core, Pokemon has always been a fancy version of rock, paper, scissors. But Pokemon Red and Blue are about as balanced as Stephen Hawking on a tightrope. Of course, the biggest and most well-known issue is that Psychic was not a balanced type at all, due to how they broke down stats in the earliest games. By combining special attack and defense into one stat, it allowed most of the Psychic Pokemon to just run wild, especially when they barely had any weaknesses. At this point, the Dark type did not exist yet, so the only super effective options were Bug and Ghost, and the only two decent Bug types in this generation were Scyther and Pinsir, who don't learn any Bug type moves.
Hey, is this Mr. Pokemon? I'm gonna slap you in the teeth.
And Ghost type is not that much better. For some reason, Lick did not work on Psychic types. I'm not sure if that was to protect Abra at all costs, but when you put it all together, it made Psychic types really annoying to fight. And it didn't stop there, critical hits were also busted. All critical hits were calculated off of the speed stat. So if you had a very fast Pokemon like Dugtrio, he's gonna have a very easy time critting your entire team, especially if you pair that with a move like Slash, which already has a high crit chance, and then you're pretty much guaranteed to just critical hit everything in your path. Moves like Fire Spin and Wrap will just completely lock you out, meaning your Pokemon can do nothing and you just have to deal with that until it's over. And there was just a 1 in 256 chance of an attack with perfect accuracy missing. So with all of these bad things, you would think I hate Pokemon Red and Blue.
I don't, I actually love these games.
I know Pokemon Red and Blue are buggy, but I really enjoy them. And I'm willing to admit that could 100% be nostalgia, because growing up, I played these games a lot. So I totally understand if you started with a later game in the Pokemon series and worked your way back to Red and Blue, how going from something like Ruby and Sapphire all the way back to this could be very jarring. But there's something about going back in time and seeing Pokemon as it originally was that I really enjoy. There were so many ways to break the game to do pretty much anything you want, whether it's get a level 100 Nidoking off the start, or breaking the game in order to get a Mew, or summoning Satan. Anything you set your mind to is pretty much possible in this game. In my opinion, every Pokemon fan should play this at least once in their life. Pokemon Yellow is also in the same boat for different reasons. This was the first deluxe version of a Pokemon game that we ever got, and if you were a fan of the Pokemon anime, and let's be honest, if you were playing Pokemon in the 90s and early 2000s, you probably were, then this was the game for you. Just like Ash, you get your very own pet Pikachu, and you get to go on the same journey that you do in Red and Blue, but this time they threw in some flair from the anime to make it really stand out, like changing up some trainers' Pokemon to be more in line with the anime, adding in fan favorites like Jesse and James, and though you can't pick your favorite starter right off the rip, throughout the game, you're given the chance to get all 3 of the starter Pokemon from this region, meaning without trading, you could have a team full of starter Pokemon. They streamlined pretty much everything about this game to make it far more digestible. Like in Pokemon Red, where it was really hard to get through Brock if you pick Charmander, now Nidoran male and female both learn Double Kick at level 12, so even though you're locked into a Pikachu, you can still get through the gym pretty easily. And I think Pokemon Yellow is the best way to play through this earliest generation of Pokemon games, unless there's a very specific Pokemon that you can't get in Yellow that you need to have, like Raichu, or you just want to have fun breaking the game with all of the glitches in Red and Blue. But overall, Red, Blue, and Yellow are going to get a 8.5 out of 10. Not too far down the line on the Game Boy Advance, we got Pokemon FireRed and LeafGreen. The upgrade from the Game Boy to the Game Boy Advance was a massive one. As you can tell by just kind of looking, there was a massive difference between these games and the originals. Using the engine from Ruby and Sapphire, they brought the Kanto region to life in ways that were not possible on older hardware. And even though I love Red and Blue a lot, I think FireRed and LeafGreen were upgrades in every sense of the term. The core of the gameplay is pretty much the same. You go on your journey fighting gyms, battling Team Rocket, and catching and collecting as many Pokemon as you could possibly find. But all of the quality of life changes that were brought to the newer Pokemon games were added in here. This time you could play as both a male or female character, which has no overall effect on the story, but it's really nice they added that as an option. Throughout Generation 2 and 3, they added a bunch of things to balance out the Pokemon formula, like adding the Dark and Steel type to completely rebalance the game, along with changing how critical hits work, separating the special stat into special attack and special defense, and so much more. Even the Sevi Islands alone would have been enough to make this the premier way to play, but the fact that they allow you to use all of the Pokemon from Generation 1 through Generation 3 in Kanto easily makes this better than the original was, so if you're someone who wants to experience Kanto in the best way possible, I think this is the best way to do it. Easily giving these games a 9 out of 10. And the last new games we got that took place in Kanto were Pokemon Let's Go Pikachu and Let's Go Eevee. And these are both incredible and terrible at the same time.
Now the math's just not checking out.
I've talked about the Let's Go games a couple times now, and there are some great parts about them, don't get me wrong, but all of the good is surrounded by a shell of bad. On a positive note, they made Kanto look stunning. In Generation 6, Pokemon jumped into the world of 3D graphics, and for a while they just kinda looked fine, but the Let's Go games look incredible. This is exactly what I want a Pokemon remake to look like. They took the Kanto region from pixel art to HD perfectly. If only they could have done that with another one of their games.
Stop bullying me!
All of the Pokemon, the characters, the routes, and the towns look insane. And if they kept everything that was great about the other games and just gave me an upscaled version of FireRed and LeafGreen, I would have been happy. But that is not what we got. The Let's Go games were made to inspire people who were fans of Pokemon Go or people who have never played a Pokemon game before to hop into the world of Pokemon for the first time in a long time. And this game is chock full of Pokemon Go mechanics, and if you're a fan of those, I am totally for it. But as someone who is a massive fan of Pokemon in their original format, I would have loved for there to have been an option to turn this off and have the game work as it did in the other Pokemon games. I am all for changing and experimenting with the Pokemon formula like they did in Legends Arceus, but at least in that game, you can still play it mostly like you would in a normal Pokemon game. But if you're not a fan of the Let's Go catching mechanics, you're not going to have a good time here, because every time you run into a wild Pokemon, it is a small game of Pokemon Go. Having the Pokemon Go mechanics stink. But there was a positive. RNG overworld encounters no longer exist. If you want to battle a Pokemon on the overworld, you have to physically walk into that Pokemon, which makes it so much easier to hunt for your favorite Pokemon. Or if you're a shiny hunter, this made the process so much less painful. But the only other thing that really bothered me about Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee is that they changed up the story and it doesn't feel like it did back in the old games. You have a brand new rival who is not blue, and you don't play as red. And I'm right in the middle of how how to feel about this. On one hand, I'm glad they didn't do the same story for the third time, but on the other hand, I wish they either changed nothing or changed way more than what they did. The new rival is just kind of there, similar to all of the other rivals that were added after Generation 3, and even though the rest of the game remains largely the same, all of these changes put together adds up to being just kind of a neutral game. So I'm giving Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee a 6.5 out of 10. But when you put it all together, I think Kanto is still a very good Pokemon generation. Pokemon would not be what it is today if it wasn't for these games. Having such a strong foundation allowed the Pokemon series to grow to an astronomical size, being one of the most popular series ever made. I think Kanto is a properly rated region. I'm gonna give it an 8.5 out of 10, mostly because of Bellsprout.